Welcome to Raven Talk, the official podcast of the Raven Tribe. The Raven Tribe is a home for warriors on the path, and is dedicated to training warriors for the battlefield of life. Visit us on the web at theraventribe.com, where you can learn more information on membership, warrior training, as well as links to our official YouTube channel, Facebook group, apparel store, and our official bookstore, Marshall Books.
Welcome back, Tribe. We're here today with special guest Kevin Secours, and we're going to be discussing the arts of Systema, Russian martial arts, and combat Systema. Kevin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastically well. How are you?
Oh, great. Glad to have you on, and looking very forward to picking your brain on what I find to be a very, very interesting topic. And Kevin, for the audience at home, if I could ask for their benefit, and I usually ask all the guests, if you could just give us a little bit about your training background, kind of where you started in the martial arts and what you've done that's led you up to this point in your career.
Sure. I started when I was 10 in Shotokan Karate, and I stayed in that for about 6 years up until my brown belt. Switched off to a Japanese style of jiu-jitsu called Akai Ryu, which the way it was taught to me was quite traditional. We had a lot of traditional sort of samurai strategies and weapon work. And then my teacher moved after a few years, and I was kind of left in a void. I dabbled in judo, I did some aikido, and then invariably I got into different styles of kempo, doing a lot of Hawaiian kempo and kempo jiu-jitsu through a host of different instructors. I had achieved my first degree black belt in Akai and earned a third degree black belt under kempo jiu-jitsu, and that was a period of huge cross training. I was training with I remember probably the first huge influence on me in 93, was Larry Hartzell, who was a big Jeet Kune Do guy that fused a lot of grappling in, and I was a big grappling head early before the UFCs made it popular. And then trained quite a few times with Eric Paulson as well, and that was very influential early on. Then I started dabbling. I dabbled in some Sambo. I did some Muay Thai. I did Takiti Tercia Cali for about 2 years here with a Montreal legend, Philippe Jelena, who was an extremely talented practitioner and one of the founding Dog Brothers. And then I discovered Russian Systema in mid-98. And at first I was really looking to do it sort of as a complement. There was just some interesting ideas that I thought were different from what I had seen. So I thought I was going to go in and pick and choose some pieces. But I became very intrigued by it as an overall operating system. And in about 6-7 months, I decided to pursue it full bore, and I've been doing it ever since.
Now, Kevin, can you tell us a little bit about what Systema is? I remember when Systema, came into the martial arts scene in the United States, and it was very different from the sense that almost every other art that you can have access to today, I've kind of heard of in some way or another, whether it be just an obscure reference in a book or, a video clip somewhere. But Systema seemed to come out of nowhere into the Western market. Can you tell me a little bit about where it comes from and why we hadn't heard about it before?
Sure. I think the first thing to realize is that Russia does have its own lineage of martial traditions, which are also, I would say, even less well-known still in the West than most Systema. And the earliest recorded mention of them was by Nestor the chronicler in the 10th century. And at that point, there's already references to Cossack practices, in those days, pagan practices of group fistfighting, which was used, as strange as it sounds, as a cultural celebration during festivals. And it could take various forms, but oftentimes it was not unlike a soft version of gladiatorial combats in ancient Rome, where they would reenact events. And they were really largely looking to reenact that sense of invasion and defense, because Russia did have a long history of its border, which was huge, being attacked over and over. So it could take forms where you would have two lines of men sort of running at each other. You could have three guys in the middle, back to back, defending against a horde of people. And there were certain regulations. Early on, by the 10th century when it was first mentioned, it was already frowned upon by government. Throughout history, it could be punishable by imprisonment or public flogging. You could be deprived of a Christian burial for partaking in it. So it was quite viewed as being somewhat anti-Christian, anti-establishment, and government was definitely working against it, but it existed as a very strong tradition. It was defined very much because it was concerned with this mass attack group setting with a lot of elliptical, whipping figure eight motions. And the idea is that rather than having sort of straight piston-like punches that would go to one target and come back, it sought to really go through a target into another, and to never really stop. And it also a 360-degree perspective, where it was always anticipating attack from the side and from behind. There were grappling strategies. Those were some of the first things that were made illegal in competition, leg snaring and tripping and throws, just because of the danger. Over time, it grew to include limitations where unmarried men would fight separately and married men would be considered older and they would fight in separate divisions. But it continued to exist despite the sort of government opposition to it. And there are many lineages of that traditional Cossack fighting, like the Gruntovsky line, which still exist to this day. So they're really interesting insights into ancient Russian tradition. A lot of the sort of pure Russian advocates will say that it is entirely autonomous and unique. An outside observer will notice similarities to a lot of Chinese martial arts. There's certainly some commonalities in my eyes, and things like this. And because a lot of the Cossacks did work as bodyguards and mercenaries in China, there's a lot of cross-border travel. I think it comes as no mystery that there would be cross-pollination there. So, who came up with it first really is not a concern to me, but interpretation is quite different. And then we flash forward to 1917. Soviet government comes to power. One of the first things they want to do is basically create a new ideology. So they outlaw all traditions, all cultural values, traditions, all ancient practices, along with religion, along with any sort of superstition, astrology, things like this. In order to sort of replace it, what they do is they create a commission, the Dynamo Commission, Dynamo Council, that basically is investigating martial traditions throughout Asia, investigating the indigenous Russian martial arts, and then creating a fusion, testing it to see what works best for their conditions. And from that stemmed three basic tiers of martial practice. The first being sports sambo, which was created for more general military consumption. The second was combat sambo, which was for slightly more elite tiers, and it was more specialized in its approach. And then, of course, Systema, which originally was referred to as Sam-Oz, later became known as just the system. And this was intended more for special operatives or people operating perhaps not necessarily with full military gear, under harsh circumstances, fatigued, injured, exhausted. So it was very much for the special operatives. It did become used by some special forces teams, and it went forward from there through various different lineages, and then was first released in, I think it was 1993, where it was first revealed outside of the borders of Russia to the Western world, and that's why it sort of seemed to pop up out of nowhere.
Now, Kevin, is Systema, does the term refer to one specific art, or is that a catch-all term for related arts?
It's a little bit of a hotbed, depending on who you speak to. I mean, if you look at what basically happened is Spiridonov, who was the largest, arguably the godfather of Systema, had created a system that wasn't named. He was looking at the version of combat sambo because he was quite injured and quite sickly. Interestingly enough, from a bayonet wound and then a long period in prison because he refused to refute initially the Asian influences on what he was teaching, because there was a lot of Asian hybridization, and Spiridonov had spent some time in Japan, and he was deeply influenced by the idea of judo, not so much as a tactical system, but because the Japanese were facing a period of sort of cultural rebuking and repulsion, where the youth growing up had seen these second generation samurai that had never seen combat in their life. They were wondering, why do we even have these vestiges of antiquity? Why do they exist? The warrior walking down the street with a top knot becomes sort of a laughing stock next to the Western firearm, and so there's this knee-jerk repulsion of traditional values in Japan. And Jigoro Kano, when he created judo, he very much was looking to sort of refine the essence of many of the traditional Japanese martial arts to something palatable, testable, and something that was quite safe that he could implement, of course, in all school systems. He had grading systems. He got it into the military, and of course, even into the Olympics. So that was a deep influence on Spiridonov. And when he was creating SAMOS, he was looking to create something that was widely accessible to everybody, that could be usable by a large sample of population. He died before it was complete, and so that work was passed off to a gentleman by the name of Kadeshnikov. And Kadeshnikov is, you'll see him oftentimes on the internet. He's an elderly gentleman, gray hair, usually performing his Systema in a suit and tie. And he's something of he was, I believe, originally a professor of rocketry for the Russian government. And he was very scientific, and he took a very biomechanical approach. But he was the one who created the first structured curriculum for the military. So many would argue that he would be the first actual godfather of Systema, as he was the first one operating under that term, under that name. And his top protege was a gentleman by the name of Rutinsky. Rutinsky was a master of sport in Sambo and I believe a sixth dan in judo. And he created his own version called Ross, which had more sportive variety to it. It had more pressure testing. They used jacketed wrestling that resembled Sambo, gloved boxing and different elements. Rutinsky himself does regard Kadeshnikov as the founder of Systema, but he just took it a slightly different direction. And he was himself probably the most prolific instructor for the military in Russia and for the KGB for over 20 years. And then from those lineages come lots of offshoots. The lineage that's actually most known in North America is the Vasilyev-Ryabko lineage. And depending on who you speak to, I was in the Vasilyev lineage from 98 till 2010. Had tremendous respect for Vlad, but we definitely had a difference of opinions that led to me splitting off. Early on, it was open that there were these influences. Early Vladimir videos had footage of Kadeshnikov, had footage of Rutinsky in them, and other Cossack lineages as well, for that matter. And there were charts that were derived directly from Rutinsky's handbooks. There was an open structure that was largely borrowed, some would say stolen, from that lineage. Later on, Vladimir fell in with Ryabko, who is the sort of heavy gentleman that is probably the most ridiculed when you think of Systema on the internet. And Ryabko's approach is quite different. It's much more intuitive, much less structured, much more based on breath, deeply infused with religious faith, and there were many elements in it that just were not in keeping with what I was interested in. What first attracted me, I later realized, was really the Kadeshnikov routine, the biomechanics, and so that's what led me to split off. But in the West, ironically, many people associate the Ryabko version with Systema. And they think that is the catch-all, that is representation of all Systema. I would argue that it is at best an interpretation. Some would even argue that it's not even Systema because it's a completely different take of the sort of military approach that's much more akin to an internal martial art than a military combative. So it gets quite tricky. And then even looking at the Russian history, there's a lot of misinformation. A lot of instructors will speak against each other and refute one another. So it can be tough to track down the lineage. But thankfully, with the internet, more and more video comes out that's archival, and we can see who is doing what, where, and when.
Excellent. Now, Kevin, can you tell us a little bit about the system, the lineage of Systema that you trained in when you began your training? What were some of the hallmarks of training? If you were trying to explain this to a person that's never seen the art or never experienced it, how would you describe it to somebody?
I went in, the first time I went into the school, in the Systema school, I was, multiple black belt. I had worked as a bodyguard, as a bouncer. I had real-world experiences. I was conditioned. I was ready. I was open. I certainly went in humble. And I got the snot beaten out of me. I mean, these guys, they did not have a light speed. I often joke, but it was entirely true, that the bathroom had no hand soap. There was a bag of cotton balls and a bottle of peroxide and little various tints of blood stains on the sink. There was a grungy carpet on concrete for a training surface. And there was very much a sense that if you were not Russian, the Russians were there to beat you down. But there was enough goodness in it. There was enough sort of enlightenment that came from every class, from the biomechanics, from the different approach that they had to breathing. Very pragmatic, very explorative, very non-rigid and non-sort of uniform approach that had attracted me, and it kept me coming back, even though it was a huge dent to the ego in the first few weeks. But once you got into it, once they got to know you, once they saw that you weren't there to test, that you were there to train, super great bunch of guys, and it was definitely rigorous in the early days. What defined it, I think, from like 98 to 2000, that was definitely the roughest period I was part of. Before me, I think it was even far rougher. I heard stories. It was just kind of unruly and a lot of injuries. And so it slowly got more palatable for the general public. By the time 2000, 2003, in that zone, Ryabko was already starting to be an influence, but he was distant. He would come maybe once in a while. Some guys would go to Russia. But I was still there for Vladimir. I was still training with him directly. And, he had such a deep body of military knowledge that if you picked his brain, he would just very, very honestly share it. But then over time, it started to shift more towards this intuitive approach, and the specifics and the principles and the concrete answers that so attracted me in the beginning started to move away. And that's slowly when it started to erode the interest. I started to take my own sort of path and exploration. And then I would say by around 2006, 2007, that's where there was almost no basic structure resembling the beginning. For example, in early Systema, a lot of the training began with biomechanics on the ground, learning how to move, joint optimization, joint strengthening, with very, very specific principles. And that slowly got simplified down to 4 or 5 fundamental exercises, lots of breathing, which I think, you could argue serves a spiritual purpose or breaking the character. But from a body enhancement, from a biomechanical point of view, it was not at all my thing. Early on, there was a lot of variety, a lot of specifics taught on strategy, combat psychology, and it started to change to a different direction that was, again, more faith-based, more intuitive, and it just wasn't for me. And the overall strategies, it became, in the beginning, it was much more of an open-handed system, much more gouging and slapping and chopping and low-level kicks, and it became extremely punch-centric and fist-based in later years. And again, that was much less interesting to me. So I think what defined it for me in the beginning is just this notion that they would teach a clear principle that could be testable. They would give you very specific examples of how it could look, techniques that were so different from what you had seen you could emulate them, but then an environment where you were allowed to freeform and interpret it however you wanted. And that's really what initially attracted me and brought my skill up to the next level.
So, Kevin, that brings you to a point in your career where you decide to break away from the camp, and you begin teaching combat Systema.
Yeah.
So explain to me, are you returning to what your roots were with combat Systema, or are you innovating in a new direction, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. It's definitely, to many in the Systema world, I'm a pariah. There are many that do not regard what I do as Systema, and I fully respect that opinion and disagree with it, of course. My goal in calling it combat Systema, I belabored the fact whether or not I would even keep the name Systema. And then because there was so much negative baggage, so much faith healing and no-touch psychic mumbo-jumbo on the net, that it just seemed to be a very heavy burden to wear. This notion that I kept the name to somehow enhance marketing when I already had a very strong, credible name was not at all the reason I chose it. The goal was really, I said, if I continue to teach what I'm teaching now, in all honesty, it's 85% purely Russian influenced, and it seemed disingenuous to not give it that credit and to not really continue going in that direction. I really looked at what the founders, what Kadeshnikov and Rutinsky were trying to do. I used a lot of their source material as reference along with my early training. But ultimately, as I always tell my students, a hybrid, or evolution for that matter, it's a continuing process. It doesn't arrive at a destination. So to say that in 1958, Systema achieved perfection and it should never be copied again or improved upon, it's somewhat akin to the sort of problem that plagued Jeet Kune Do. Bruce Lee created it as a notion, and then the label itself almost becomes its own prison. So I felt there was very much a need to continue to evolve the system. I think guys like Rutinsky were doing the right thing and including a lot of sportive testing, jacketed wrestling, glove boxing, because that was something measurable. What was lacking in civilian application, but what all military persons would tell me was very present, was scenario training, where verbal training, diffusion, detection, de-escalation was very, very highly present. And I hadn't seen that being offered to civilians. So I was already doing a lot of that in my own training, so I incorporated a lot of that, specifically with training with military and law enforcement myself. And so that brought its own growth, its own sort of direction, because you start to quickly realize were working for you that you were somehow trying to explain away. And as soon as I broke away, I didn't have a need to explain other people's actions. I didn't have an obligation to keep anything. So I really simplified it down, and that was the intent behind calling it combat Systema, is that I'm really only concerned with surviving the fight of life, staying healthy, staying strong, and the reality of street defense or if you're law enforcement or military, battlefield defense. And that's really all we focus on. We just look at the mechanics and joint mobility and breath to stay healthy and strong in preparation and direct application for combat. And we didn't want to get into religion and faith and beliefs and all the rest of it. We wanted to be non-denominational, have everyone welcome in an environment where nothing was discussed outside of that, and just focus on the fight itself. So that was really the goal, and that's why I broke off. Major sort of sticking points for me was that as they were growing rapidly, I didn't see any standardization of quality. In the beginning, instructors like myself would go through kind of a testing phase. We had pressure testing. We had kind of like a gauntlet that we would run through, and we would only be allowed to go for that when we had demonstrated lots of training and lots of technique. But then it came to a point where people were being a weekend training event, and the idea had become, we'll give you a rank and you'll use your life to earn it, which is fine in principle. I know many styles do this. But what it meant is that you had people representing the style that didn't even have fundamental basics on ground fighting, weapon defense, or striking. And so they might have had some exposure to one aspect of Systema, but very, very brief, very quick, and there was no standard quality. And then that led to more negative videos on the internet, more burden is a sort of a proof, and we became a main thread on Bullshido, and I think in many cases rightly so. And Systema is enigmatic and sort of experiential. It's very difficult to understand just by watching it. But a lot of it that is represented on the net, in my opinion, is crap. It is mysticism, and it is excessive faith, and it is unhealthy for the student. But some of it that can oftentimes overlap and look a little bit fantastic, like the striking, for example, does have a valid base. Wanted to go my own direction so that people that I was training with and people that I was surrounded by were not into that mysticism, and we were just looking on keeping it simple and making it pragmatic and making it measurable. So we added a fixed curriculum deeply influenced by Kalashnikov and Rutinsky. We added a system of measurement. We have 6 basic levels up to full instructor, and that has made a massive difference in quality control. It has made a massive difference in clarity. It makes running my own school effortless. It makes running the association worldwide a pleasure, and everyone speaks the same language and knows what we're trying to do.
Now, Kevin, let me ask you, because this is a common critique I've heard of Systema, and I think you're in a good place to answer that because you're discussing, maintaining the quality control. But one of the gripes I always heard from, my friends and fellow instructors, they would say, yeah, I've seen some really good Systema guys, but all the ones that are good were good at other arts before coming into Systema.
Absolutely.
And okay.
I was not a. Yep, you keep going.
Oh no, I want to know from your experience. Was there good success in bringing a student from first baby steps through the Systema curriculum only and producing somebody competent at self-defense, or is there some truth to that at the time people going through that curriculum were only successful if they had another background?
I think early on it was 100% true, or at least 100% coincidental. I know for myself, I would not have survived my early training if I hadn't had my experience that I had. I would have been demoralized. I would have been broken. I would have said, "No, this isn't for me." I found much of the time that I would spend training explaining what they meant and what we were trying to do. And oftentimes, in later years, I was trying to put a positive spin on it to sort of say, Mom and Dad aren't fighting, everything's okay, because I just couldn't believe that what was being taught was being taught. And I was trying to find some more pragmatic base in it that would work. But generally, it was only people that did have previous experience that were doing well early on. Now they have examples of people that have certainly started from Systema on square one and have fared well. My issue was that I was a professional educator first and foremost. That's what I went to university for. That was what industry I worked in before. And I knew it was possible for someone to be thrown into Systema without previous training and coincidentally become good. To paraphrase Mark Twain, they could learn, despite school and not let school interfere with their education. But they were few and far between. The vast majority would drop out and find it was not for them. And at best you could hope for marketing purposes was they would leave demoralized but say, yeah, those guys really hit. Those guys are really tough, but it's not for me. Or it was really cool, but they would leave. And I thought that was always very sad. Or I would see people that would come in with chronic injuries and they were being told it was just tension. They had to relax. But no, they had a torn meniscus. It's not tension, And they weren't being taught workarounds and they weren't being taught safe ways to move with that injury. And they were trying to be sort of all squeezed into the same mold. And that was bothersome to me. So there are some guys today that have no previous experience. I don't know that it's because the system has changed or become better. I don't think that's the case. I just think that in any given scenario, there will always be a certain sample of population that will do well in some spots. The vast majority, in my opinion, benefited from previous experience. And in my own school, I was always simultaneously teaching Systema as a separate discipline and Kempo Jiu-Jitsu as a separate discipline. And I could see that my boys that could throw a good round kick, that had a good clean jab, that had a good, throw or double leg takedown, they would often take a lot of the Systema guys to school because they had very concrete strategies. Every Systema guy you train with will tell you a story about some BJJ guy that came in and got his ass owned by some Systema guy. But far more than that, when I was there, I would see, or at seminars, I would see guys come in with a good Thai kick or good BJJ, and they were difficult. They were difficult for the guy that was just trying to breathe and move, if not completely overwhelming. So in my approach, I teach very, very fixed, solid, fundamental critiques, or fundamental basics. We teach jabs, we teach crosses, we teach, body pins, we teach specific escapes from things. How to stand, how to pivot. You have to have those foundations. And the analogy I always use is the quantum monkey story. The theory that if you have 1 million monkeys on 1 million typewriters in a room, probability dictates that eventually they will accidentally type, the complete works of William Shakespeare. But probability also dictates that if you could somehow put those monkeys in a room and train them to write those works of Shakespeare, it'd probably be a lot faster. And a more direct combative example is if I had 10 people going in one room that had no firearm experience, and that for 10 minutes they were allowed to play with guns, and then I had another group of 10 people, and for 10 minutes they would learn basic operating safety and then be allowed to explore the gun. Chances are the second group would be far less likely to be injured. They'd be far more likely to come out with some concrete confidence and knowledge because they would know what to do. And so that's really the way I looked at my approach to Systema. I wanted to keep the freedom, keep some of the playfulness, but I definitely wanted to have a fixed curriculum. And of course, that in its own right is a huge point of controversy and a source of disdain for many of my critics.
Well, Kevin, you've pretty much touched on the fact that your current interpretation of Systema is very different than what most people associate with Systema. And, obviously everybody's seen it. There's always somebody posting something on Facebook and then like 1,000 posts saying, this will never work. This will never be, functional. I've looked at Systema, and I've tried to look at it with an open mind and try to accept that maybe I don't understand everything that is being done. And I've looked at your material, and your material makes sense from what I can see. I mean, it looks logical. It looks like there's just, logical application of proper, biomechanics. So I want to ask you just on the mechanical level of what you're teaching, because to be real honest and not to disparage anybody that's doing, a different form of Systema, but, what I've seen, I look at and I would say, yeah, I probably would not, send my kid there to learn if he had to survive a life and death encounter tomorrow. But I look at your stuff and I say, yeah, that looks totally fine. That looks like it would work. So what is the difference? What did you go back to, and just the mechanical level, what's different that you can explain to the audience and maybe they can kind of appreciate your approach a little bit better?
Sure. I mean, foundationally, the biomechanical exercises you'll see, for example, in Kadeshnikov Systema, they do a lot of just basic mobility, sitting, squatting, flexing the legs in different types of positions that are very much influenced and inspired by the motion of a toddler. If you look at how a child sits when they're completely in custody of their flexibility, when they're fully able to do whatever they want with their bodies, that's the way we're all entitled to move and sit. But over life, we become divorced from the ground. We become strangers from the planet we walk on, and we forget how to squat and flop on the ground and roll around. When's the last time you just laid on your back and rolled around in the living room? Most adults don't do this. So there's very much a sense of playing in Systema where we want to reclaim that youthfulness, but also guided by an understanding of the joints. Whereas a child won't understand that the knee is a hinge and can't be rotated, we learn exactly why the knee's hurting, because the hip is a rotational joint and it's not being used correctly, or we're overly tense in the lower back, and so on. And so there's a lot of very specific exercises for identifying our existing limitations, learning immediate workarounds, and then learning rehab to make them stronger. It's not unlike the Feldenkrais approach or the Alexander method for body work. There are elements that's like the natural gymnastics you find in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but it's just very scientific. It's very definitively Soviet, I would guess, in the way that it's taught, very mathematical. And then on the other side, there's this very almost contradictory playfulness where once you have it, you're just allowed to sort of explore your body on the ground. So that's one of the hallmarks of pure original Systema that I've definitely kept. One of the elements where I would say I'm on the frontier, where the hard-nosed skeptic will say, but look, he's doing the exact same flaky stuff those guys are doing. They do a lot of work. Systema, the belief is really you should start with contact first rather than speed. And by that they mean rather than me throwing off jabs, getting faster and faster, and you learning how to do jab catches, which is good, it's fine, but it's just you're not really learning how to move the body in its fullness. They'll start with the fist against the face, push the face over and over, so that you identify first and foremost how it is you flinch, because not everybody flinches the same way. Some people will tensen up the neck and step back against the jab. Some people will cower down with the face and present the forehead. Some people will turn away and give their side or their back. So one of the first things we do in Systema is identify how we respond to certain stimuli. Some stimuli will make us freak out. Some people can't be grabbed around the neck. So how are you going to teach that person a choke escape if I touch your neck and you freak out? I can just slam the choke on you, but then there's always going to be that inherent fear of the choke that's irrational. So we start with slow contact. There's a lot of moving the body, pushing the body. And so when people see work being done with a firearm or with a knife where I'm poking and pushing and the person's just yielding to it, the student is initially being told to allow the pressure to move them. That it's impossible to move too soon in the early phases. It's only possible, too late rather, only too soon. You want to let the knife or the gun poke itself into you so you feel exactly what's contracting in your body. And it's a very internal kind of moving meditation. It's an exploration of body intelligence to see, wow, I didn't realize my knee doesn't have any flexion, or I tension up all the way down to the feet. And then slowly we educate that. And the idea is that when we move out to range an hour or two later, we will respond in the exact same way sooner. So if somebody goes to reach into their pocket to pull out a gun, the body's already blading and yielding exactly as you would when it was poked with the gun. The problem is that's hard to explain in a YouTube clip, and what people often put up is drill. And the drilling is, shows people sliding around, letting the blade slide across their throat, and people say, wow, that guy's letting himself get cut. And he is. He's volunteering for the cut in the early practice, kind of like a Chinese kung fu practitioner doing iron qigong volunteers to get hit, so they learn how to deal with it. Although they're dealing with it in a more resistant, obstructive way, we're dealing with it more in a yielding way. So that on the outside can look a little bit flaky, a little bit weird. In my belief and in my experience, this has been one of the biggest advantages of Systema. This is really one of the best ways to erode fear in a new student. It's one of the greatest ways to awaken the need to understand movement. Where I have grievances is that many people in Systema mistake the drill for the application, and then they do it a little faster, but the attacker is still fully compliant like a zombie, running forward with an arm outstretched, and the defending teacher or student is doing it almost exactly like the drill, which was hyper-relaxed, hyper-exaggerated. So it's at that point, once you've sort of tilled the soil, that I think the specificity of biomechanics and technique need to be sown. And that's where we differ. But there's a lot on body intelligence, a lot on intuitive movement that, you see guys like Ido Portal and guys like this that are teaching Conor McGregor in the UFC. They have a similar approach in their own work, and they also attract a lot of the same criticisms because externally it looks outlandish. It's so different from what we're used to.
Well, and give me your thoughts on it, because as a practitioner of Filipino martial arts, I often see this kind of thing with like Huba drills, where you'll be doing the Huba drills and they should serve one specific function, but then the teacher kind of forgets and they just keep doing it as application.
Exactly. Ina Santos said, I think we should learn the drill to forget the drill, right? And even in my approach to Systema, I often whip out Huba because the fundamental movement, the double pass, is essential. It's incredible. But if I go into a knife fight with the expectation that I have to double tap, it's difficult. You're trying to now fit a round peg into a square hole. There are times you can just charge in. There are times you can clinch. There are times you can just outright grip it. So it's exactly the same thing. People just mistaking the drill as an application. And because the drills in Systema on top, Huba at least on paper looks impressive. When you see a Huba drill being done really fast, the uneducated viewer goes, wow, that guy knows how to fight, because it looks like a Born Identity clip. But if you look at a Systema drill, it already looks a little bit nebulous. It looks like drunken yoga. And then if somebody says that's the drill, and people don't even understand the base drill to begin with, now you're confusing it as the application. It gets even worse.
Well, I understand. I think that's something that viewers should keep in mind when seeing things. The context means everything when you're viewing something. And before you judge, a system based on a 20-second YouTube clip, you want to really understand the context of what's really going on there. So, Kevin, let me ask you, you touched upon this, that you started Systema kind of with the intention of having it be an add-on to your martial arts training that you already had established.
Yes.
How does Systema work best? And let's say combat Systema, not Systema in general. But is this something that is a skill that people could pick up as an add-on and maybe find some useful drills that incorporate, or does that become confusing and counterproductive? Is it better just to study the art? I know from experience, different, I think the phrase you used earlier was an operating system. And some styles use a certain operating system and some use a different one. And when you try to mesh them, unfortunately, what you get is kind of like a sloppy soup and really have things that may seem like a good idea to put together, but really don't, and you'd probably be better off letting them operate independently. So what are your thoughts on that as far as how, combat Systema can be trained?
Well, certainly when I first started Systema, it really, that's why I had to go into it full bore, is that it didn't lend itself to that. And one of the sort of governing objectives in my own teaching from early on was always to make it accessible to the layman. I didn't like being in a room when, I had a very long and rigorous martial experience. I trained a long time, but I also trained extremely hard. It was a full-time job all the time for me. And I was very confident in my existing skills, even though I had little dents to the ego and I said, wow, this is really challenging for me. I didn't look at all of my existing skills and say, now they're garbage. I still knew they had saved my life many times. They were very good. I just saw an opportunity to make them better. But many people, surprisingly to me, had fundamental lackings in confidence. They had 40 years in multiple styles, and if they were told it was garbage, they were throwing it out. And this, to me, was tragic. And so from the earliest time in my training, I really had the goal of making it something that could be taken piecemeal, that could be taken component by component. So whenever I teach, if you watch clips on YouTube of myself, I very, very seldomly say anything negative about other approaches. I have my students go down on their fists and determine what facet they prefer. Is it 3 knuckles or is it 2 knuckles? I'm a 2-knuckle puncher. I tell all my students that so that they understand why I'm taking certain angles. But then I demonstrate if I was doing it with 3, I might go off to a slightly different angle. When I think back to most of the teachers I had, if I go to karate or if I go to silat, man, some of them were like religiously 2 knuckles. Others, my kung fu instructors were absolute 3 knucklers, and there was no debate about it. You had to do it their way. And when I think about how much time was lost feeling a little bit awkward in that skin, kind of you left, right, and center that one facet's better than the other, but somebody out there is going to prefer the other one, and maybe for them it is better. How do you test something like that, So I really want people to be able to take whatever it is they want from it and to use it and just make themselves better. Some stuff will not mesh, I try to keep up a lot of my yoga practice using some of the Systema breathing, which is much more vigorous, and it didn't lend itself to maintaining balance. Systema breathing lends itself to mobility much more than stillness. And at first I tried, I abandoned the Ujjayi breath from yoga, and then I returned to it. And I said, if I'm going to do yoga, I'm going to use the majority of the system because it works well together. Other things completely changed for me. I've modified how I do my groundwork in jiu-jitsu based on how I move in Systema, and I've changed my jiu-jitsu curriculum as a result of it. If I find a better way, it's demonstrably, measurably better, and it's working for the majority of the population, I switch it. To me, the definition of a scientific approach is not that it can be proven, but it's that it can be disproven. And if I prove something to not be working as well, I want to get rid of it because we don't have that time to waste. So I definitely think the way I approach it and the way I encourage my instructors in our group to approach it is really to invite anyone in and to let them, I always say it's your carnival, ride it your way. You want to do it the way you feel comfortable.
Kevin, I want to thank you for being on the show. It was very enlightening to speak with you. I'm glad that you were able to give us some increased insight into this often misunderstood, martial art. Can I ask you to do me a favor before we go? If anybody out there listening hasn't seen your material, I do want to recommend that you go out and check out Kevin's material. I found it very interesting. I've rented a few DVDs and taken a look at them, and they're definitely something you want to look into. Can you tell us where people can find you on the web if they're interested in joining your association, if they want to bring you out for seminars or workshops? And I know that you also have an online learning program as well. What can you tell us about that, and where can people find you?
Sure. Just to contact me, it's combatsystema with an A at the end .com. I have an online website, or online learning website, which is kevinsecours.com. That has a lot of downloadable video material as well. We have a series of DVDs and a book with Paladin Press, if you guys are familiar with Paladin. So you can pretty much find me everywhere. My last name is it's the French word for help, Secours. So if you put in Kevin Secours, I will come up guaranteed.
Great. Well, Kevin, again, I want to thank you for making time in your schedule to be with us, and we look forward to having you on in the future.
Awesome. All the best in your training.